the cell membrane, which is having the major role in the general physiology. Okay, so cell membrane is made up of various contents, and the basic things which we will see is the cell membrane is made up of lipids, proteins, and carbohydrates. Okay, the cell membrane is made up of lipids, proteins, and carbohydrates. Among the lipids, it includes 42% of the cell membrane, and the protein constitutes 55%, and the carbohydrate constitutes only 3%. So which is the major content of the cell membrane? Major content of the cell membrane is proteins, and the second major content is lipids. The lipids is the one which is going to give the structure to the cell membrane. Okay, cell membrane is the one which is giving structure to the cell, and the cell membrane, that structure itself is maintained by the lipids. And in the lipids, you have the other contents of lipids. What are all the other contents is phospholipids, cholesterol, and other lipids. This phospholipid is the one which is going to maintain the cell membrane, which is going to give the structure to the cell membrane. So this is what you are seeing here, the red color structures. That is the phospholipid, and I will draw one single phospholipid. This is the structure of a phospholipid. You have a head and the tail. The head is globular in shape. Okay, so you have a bilipid layer of phospholipid like this. Why it is localized like this, not like this? The bilipid layer, why it is not like this? Why it is arranged like this? Why not like this? Which is polar and which is non-polar? Can you tell the terminology head and tail, which is polar, which is non-polar? Head is polar. What is meant by polar? The head is called as polar. Why? Polar is also called as hydrophilic. So the head portion is called as polar end, and the tail portion is called as non-polar end. So the cell membrane, in both sides of the cell membrane, see, you consider this as the cell. Outside the cell, you have the extracellular fluid, and inside the cell, you have the intracellular fluid. So both sides of the cell membrane is covered with the fluids. Okay. So in the phospholipid structure, this polar head, okay, it is polar, which is also called as hydrophilic. It means it is having affinity towards the fluids. Whereas the tail portion is called as non-polar, which is also called as hydrophobic. It is having phobia. It is having fear when it is facing the fluids. So that is why it is not localized. It is not arranged like this. It is arranged in this manner. See in this picture, the bilipid phospholipids. The bilayer of the phospholipids is organized in this manner. The lipids, what is the basic property of the lipids? Will it be stable? Is it flexible? Lipids, the general property, very basic general property. Will the lipids be very flexible or very stability? It is having the stability, very flexible. So it means how it will maintain the structure of the cell membrane. So in order to make it stable, if you just make the phospholipids as the bilipid layer, the cell membrane will not be stable. Okay. So it was highly flexible because of the lipid nature. Okay. In order to make it stable, in between the phospholipids, you have the proteins. Okay. So the proteins is further classified as you have two types of proteins. One is the integral proteins and the other one is peripheral proteins. So integral proteins, as the name, it is integrated with the entire length of the cell membrane. See, these are all the integral proteins. These are all the integral proteins and these are all the integral proteins. These are all the integral proteins. It is integrated with the entire length of the cell membrane. Okay, so that is why it is called as integral proteins. So in between all the phospholipids, there is so many integral proteins. The proteins is not highly flexible as like that of lipids, right? So it will give a little of stability to the cell membrane, so the structure of the cell will be maintained. And what about the peripheral proteins? So these are all the peripheral proteins, which is not present towards the entire thickness of the cell membrane. It may be present in either the outside of the cell membrane or the inner side, the one which is facing the extracellular fluid or the one which is facing the intracellular fluid. Okay, so that is called as the peripheral proteins. And in the lipids also, you have the phospholipids, cholesterol and other lipids. So all these are all the cholesterols and other lipids which will also present in the surfaces of the phospholipids, which will give further stability to the bilipid layer of the cell membrane. Okay, and now this integral proteins, it is having a major role in the transport mechanism, which is the important mechanism, and it is a very basic mechanism and very dry mechanism to understand, to study, to listen, to remember. But it is a very important mechanism which we are going to deal in all over physiology. The sodium potassium pump, sodium importer, sodium antiport, import, all those things. Passive transport, active transport, simple diffusion, facilitated diffusion. So all those things we will be coming across throughout the physiology. In between you will see somewhere the sodium potassium pump, active transport, passive transport, then depolarization, repolarization, all those things. That is the very basic concept. That is why it is coming under the general physiology. So that transport mechanism, that is given by the integral proteins. These integral proteins, since it is present throughout the entire length of the cell membrane, it is also going to function like a channels. Either it may be voltage gated, ligand gated, so many things we will see in the future slides. Okay, so that is the integral proteins and the peripheral proteins. And now, what about the carbohydrates? What is the percentage of carbohydrates? Only 3%. But it is having also a role in the maintenance of cell membrane. It is like, for example, the carbohydrate which is attached to the lipids, they are called as glycolipids. The term glyco is for carbohydrates. The carbohydrates which is attached to the proteins, glycoproteins. So this carbohydrates is going to function like a entire most covering, that is called as glycocalyx. The carbohydrate, it is maintaining the role called as glycocalyx. How it is going to take part its role, where it is going to take part its role in maintaining the cell membrane is like, for example, you're having a big plate and the plate is fully filled with various brands of chocolates, and you need to take the plate of chocolate in, for example, in a bus. For 1 hour you are going to travel. Is there a chance for even a single chocolate to get out of the plate? If you are traveling in a bus, the road is very rough, no smooth road. Even if the road is very smooth, will the chocolate be remain in the plate during the travel? So how will you protect without even single chocolate coming out of the plate? You will wrap it with a cover. So as like that, this carbohydrate, even though it constitutes only 3%, it is going to give the entire cell membrane like a wrapping mechanism. So that is why the covering of the carbohydrate, we call it as glycocalyx. So overall, the phospholipids is giving the flexible structure, and in between the integral proteins, peripheral proteins and other lipids like cholesterol, everything is going and giving still slighter stability, and the entire stability of the cell membrane is given by the calyx, the wrapping mechanism of the carbohydrates. That is what you call as the glycocalyx. So now the entire cell membrane is having its stability. So now the cell membrane is ready to give shape to the cell. Okay, so that is what is the cell membrane. If you understand the cell membrane, the parts of the cell membrane, what is the role of lipids, why the lipids is arranged in a bilipid layer in this manner, not in this manner. So if you understand all these concepts, it will be easy for you to understand the other physiological systems. Okay. Okay. So few things in the cell membrane. In the cell membrane, we have seen the lipid content is 42% and the proteins is higher. And there is one exception for this concentration, that is in the myelin sheath. In the nerve cells, the myelin sheath is having a major role in the conduction of impulse. So in the myelin sheath, the lipids will be higher than that of the proteins or equal. Okay. So in this, the lipids will be either greater or equal to the proteins. Okay. So that is one exception with the composition of the proteins and lipids. And there is one more concept called as caveolae. Have you heard about the term caveolae? Yes. So caveolae are small depression-like structures like this, which is having a role in the signal transmission. Okay. So this is about the cell membrane. And now coming to the solubility of substances with the cell membrane, which is having a role in the transport mechanisms. So the lipids, proteins and carbohydrates are the major composition of the cell membrane. So lipids, what are all the substance it is going to transmit from one side of the cell to the other side, either from inside to the outside or from outside to the inside. Either way, you need the transport mechanism to happen. Okay, so the lipids is going to transmit only the lipid soluble substances. The most common lipid soluble substances, oxygen and carbon dioxide, because it is the most important substance which has to be transported always without any hindrance. It does not need any signal to transfer. Oxygen and carbon dioxide will not wait for any signal mechanism, any stimulus mechanisms for the transfer. It has to happen continuously since birth. Even before birth, it is happening through the circulation from the mother placental mechanisms. Okay. So oxygen and carbon dioxide, since it is the most important gases which has to take place in the transfer mechanism without any hindrance. They are the lipid soluble substances. And the water soluble substances will not travel through the lipid membrane because of the hydrophobic nature. So water soluble substances will not dissolve in the lipid layer, will not dissolve in the bilipid layer of the cell membrane. So it needs to get transferred. What are the water soluble substances? Most common, glucose, amino acids, okay, and other proteins. They are all, the proteins means they are the one which is having the role in the proteins is forming the neurotransmitters, hormones, enzymes and other chemicals, everything. It is made up of proteins, the amino acids, various combinations of the amino acids is giving rise to the proteins. Okay, so that is forming the hormones, enzymes, chemicals for digestion and other mechanism, neurotransmitters. So how these are all getting secreted inside the cell. And they are all some hormones is released from one cell and it has to go and work with the some other parts of the body which is the target organ. How these gets transferred? It is by the proteins. Which protein is involved in the transport mechanism? Integral proteins. These integral proteins, it is giving stability to the cell membrane. And these integral protein, it is performing its role as a transport channels. They are the one which is having its role in the transport mechanism. So regarding the solubility, we have two solubles. One is water soluble substances and the other one is lipid soluble substances, that is oxygen and carbon dioxide. And water soluble substances, it includes amino acids, proteins, glucose, etc. Okay, so this is how the solubility is happening. Lipid soluble substances will diffuse through the lipid layer and it is getting transported from one side to the other side. And water soluble substances, it will be transferred with the help of the protein channels. In detail about the transport mechanism, we will see. Okay.